Everybody. We really look forward to a very interesting discussion today. It's one of the key projects that we've been working on recently in partnership with our partners, the UNDP. We'll be talking about the impact of COVID-19 on inequality in Jordan. I'd like to just make a couple of logistics remarks before we make a start. There's Arabic translation available should you wish to tune into listening to the report findings and the discussions on the Arabic channel. You'll find the little globe icon that you press on and you tune into the channel you'd like to follow on. And there's also an opportunity at any point in time, should you wish to have questions or comments, to place that in the Q&A section for the consideration of our speakers to attend to during the Q&A session. Without further ado, we'll make a formal start to the session, and I'd like to request Randa Abul Hosn, a resident rep for Jordan, to give her welcome remarks, and then we proceed.
Thank you very much, Shireen. Good afternoon, everyone. It's so good to see old friends and colleagues and new friends and colleagues online. And today's session is actually quite interesting, and I have to say that start by thanking ERF for their very fruitful partnership with UNDP Jordan. I think the idea of this study started in April 2020 after the release of the UNDP Human Development Report entitled Beyond Income, Beyond Averages, Beyond Today, which addressed inequalities in human development from a different perspective. The main perspective was that inequalities was previously framed solely around economics and around GDP, but under the shadow of the climate crisis, sweeping technological changes, and the impact of COVID, and more recently, the war in the Ukraine, inequalities in human development are taking on new forms. We feel it is important to shed light on inequality of outcomes and opportunities in Jordan, and addressing inequality drivers are important conditions for inclusive growth and for achieving the 2030 agenda. Against this backdrop, a research partnership between ERF and UNDP Jordan was created to deepen our understanding of inequality in Jordan. And I understand that there were 4 papers that were produced for this study to be possible. One of the main limitations was data. The ERF was able to actually fill that gap with their COVID-19 MENA monitor data, which they collected and examined the impact on income inequality in education. The 4 papers that were produced were around the determinants of income inequality, inequality of outcomes of education, inequality of opportunity in education, and the impact assessment of COVID-19 on income, employment, and education in Jordan. The findings of this set of research papers was summarized in a policy report titled, Is COVID-19 Increasing Inequalities in Jordan?, which is the present report. The present report overviews the inequality status in Jordan before and after the outbreak of COVID-19. And based on the data available, the report tackles inequality in expenditure as a proxy of income inequality. And with respect to inequalities of capabilities, the report focuses on inequality in education outcomes and opportunities. I want to welcome everyone to this webinar. I think the findings of the study will be rich and provide a lot of food for thought, and will be necessary for all of us who work in the development field as practitioners to take into consideration as we formulate new programs and we advise on new policies for Jordan. Without further ado, myself, I give back over to ERF and to my colleague, Michaela Prokov, who led the study on behalf of UNDP Jordan to get us started. Thank you.
Thank you, Randa. Thank you very much. I have not had the chance to introduce Randa. I've put that in the chat. Randa is the resident representative of UNDP Jordan. Prior to this appointment, Randa was UNDP resident representative for Egypt, 2019-2021. That's when our friendship started and our joint work on different areas than inequality, actually more on the digital transformation aspects. Randa also served as UNDP Deputy Resident Representative in Algeria and Country Director in Yemen. So she has a long standing experience with UNDP. The details are further there in the bio I just shared, and I'm pleased that Dr. Ibrahim al-Badawi is now with us. He was able to join us. I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Ibrahim Badawi, Managing Director of ERF, and then we'll give the floor to Michaela and the proceedings. Dr. Ibrahim.
Thank you very much, Shireen. And thank you very much to Dr. Randa and all the colleagues from the UNDP and the researchers from Jordan. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I'm sorry I was a bit late because of the time difference. I'm still in the US. So let me, without further ado, really to welcome you all and to express our great pleasure to be part of this important work on COVID-19 and inequality in Jordan, and looking forward to the presentations and the deliberations and discussions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Ibrahim. And if I may just do like I did for Randa, Dr. Ibrahim Badawi is Managing Director of ERF, and the whole issue of inequality matters and the impact of COVID-19 is very core to our agenda recently. And similarly, partnerships with organizations like UNDP are a core element of our strategy. So thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. Michaela, the floor is yours to initiate the discussions on the report. Thank you. We can't hear you, Michaela. Michaela, can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. There's a bit of an echo.
So apologies. So thank you very much. Just a note for participants, please share your questions and comments in the chat. We will be trying to address them as we go along, and especially in the Q&A session at the end. So welcome to the presentation of findings from a research or a series of research studies on how COVID-19 has impacted on some of the key dimensions of inequality in Jordan and some initial policy implications. And perhaps before we start and before I introduce the speakers and lead commentators, I'd like to add a little bit to what Randa said. So we embarked on this research partnership prior to the outbreak of COVID-19. And just after the publication of the 2019 Global Human Development Report, which Randa mentioned that it focused on or highlighted really that it is important to look beyond the traditional measures and not only at basic capabilities, but also enhanced capabilities, which are much more important for upper middle income countries, as we've seen also strong progress in some of the basic capabilities over the last decades. And addressing inequalities really also at the core of achieving the SDGs, and in particular the ambition of the 2030 agenda of leaving no one behind and reaching the furthest behind first. But yet when we look at the data from Jordan, we felt, the motivation behind the study was really, there are many data gaps, particularly when we look at other dimensions of inequality. And part of this is also due to the availability of data, and not only availability of data, but also access to available data. And I hope this will be discussed during the session later on, what we can do to address some of these gaps. So we were motivated in addressing or in filling some of the research gaps, which became also quite, there's still quite a lot to be done. When we look at the efforts that Jordan did for the voluntary national review in pulling some of the data around inequality together, there is still huge data gaps, particularly also when we look at policy responses, what's fiscal policy doing in terms of addressing some of these, the rising inequalities. So, as I mentioned, we started this study before the outbreak of COVID-19, and therefore the earlier 3 papers focused largely or drew on the household income and expenditure survey. But we were very lucky to be able to draw on ERF's own COVID-19 MENA monitor for this policy report that will be presented today. And bearing in mind, of course, that the data that was collected and analyzed was collected while the full impact of COVID-19 was still unfolding and response measures were also still being rolled out. So again, when we look to the future, how can we address and keep monitoring how the impact is evolving, particularly when we look at also new challenges emerging, and Randa listed a few, such as the food price crises, but also the impact of climate change, and also the limited or increasingly limited fiscal space the government has in terms of addressing some of the vulnerabilities. So anyway, I also want to draw your attention to the new Global Human Development Report, since we started in the spirit of the 2019 report, which tackled the issues of inequalities. The recent one is looking more at different intersecting vulnerabilities. It's entitled Uncertain Times and Unsettled Lives. And I hope it also serves as a sort of inspiration for future research for Jordan. So anyway, I'll stop here and give the floor to a discussion on the findings and its policy recommendations. We will first have an opportunity to hear from the authors of the policy research report, and then followed by commentaries from the 3 prominent experts. So let me introduce the speakers. Rasha Ramadan, Associate Professor at the Faculty of Economics and Political Sciences of Cairo University and Research Fellow at ERF. Rasha, whose research interests include applied microeconomics on poverty, food insecurity, and human development, is also the author of one of the technical background papers which focused on the determinants of income inequality. Reham Risk, Associate Professor, Universities of Canada in Egypt. Reham is also head of the Forecasting and Modeling Unit at the Ministry of Planning and Economic Development in Egypt and Research Fellow at ERF. Reham's research focuses inter alia on inequality in the MENA region, and she's also working with the Abdul Latif Jamil Poverty Action Lab on randomized control trials. Reham, together with Nada Rostrom, authored the technical background paper on inequality of education outcomes. And the third speaker is Rana Hendi, Assistant Professor of Economics and Director of the Master's Program in Public Policy at the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy of the American University of Cairo. Rana is also a research fellow at ERF, and her research interests include gender inequality, inequality of opportunity, and the impact of trade and fiscal policies on inequality and poverty. And Rana, together with Najla Ben Mimouna, is also the author of the technical background paper on inequality of opportunity in education. So thank you very much. And so over to Rasha, Reham, and Rana. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Maghala, for the introduction. I will be speaking on behalf of my colleagues, Rana and Riham. Rana is here with us. Riham had to attend the meeting with Her Excellency Dr. Hala Said, and she'll try to join us later for the Q&A session. So first, let me thank UNDP and ERF for such an interesting project and giving us the opportunity for investigating the impact of COVID-19 on inequalities in Jordan. I would like to thank my colleague Rana and Riham for this journey of research and work together. I would like also to thank Marina Hasham for her excellent research assistant. So without further debate, let me try to motivate why we're interested in such a topic. As had been said in the introduction, that inequality is a really complex story. And as had been discussed by the Human Development Report 2019, we have to move beyond the income inequality and the monetary measure of inequality, because the story will be different if we measure income or inequality in opportunities or inequality in outcomes. And we need to investigate the different dimensions of inequality to be able to achieve the 10th Sustainable Development Goal and leave no one behind. And one important dimension that had been highlighted by the Human Development Report was the inequality in capabilities, mainly factors as education, health, access to technology, which are relevant and significant factors to achieve human development. And capabilities can be decomposed into two dimensions: basic capabilities that are necessary conditions that everyone has to have, and we have what we call advanced capabilities. So for instance, for the health dimension, life expectancy at birth can be used as a measure for basic capability, while life expectancy at 70 years old is advanced capability. For education, population with primary education can be considered as basic capability, while quality of education and population with tertiary education is advanced capability. So the different dimensions are really important to be taken into consideration and to think beyond the monetary inequality. With the COVID-19 and all the related challenges, like including economic slowdown, the widespread of loss of income and employed, we were expecting that inequality would increase with long-term consequences. Vulnerable groups, including youth, women, refugees, individuals without social protection, and informal employees, are expected to be the most affected ones. Also, individuals without access to technology and internet are expected to be highly affected. And here highlight an important dimension, that what was considered as enhanced capabilities in 2019 as access to technology and internet, with the spread of COVID-19 became a necessary capability and necessary dimension. So now children and individuals who have no access to internet cannot access education, cannot access work. So this may expect to increase the inequality and poverty for the future generations. So given all this, we saw that we need to explore what are the determinants of inequalities and what are the characteristics of vulnerable groups in Jordan before the spread of COVID-19 and after the outbreak of COVID-19. So we explore three dimensions: inequality of opportunity in education, inequality in income, but for data limitations, we use expenditure as a proxy of income, and inequality in educational outcomes. Why we focus mainly on education and not other dimensions as health and technology, this is mainly because of data limitations, and this I will talk about it in more details by the end. So let's start with a quick review with the Jordanian context, with the main important indicators. Poverty rate is the latest available rate is 15.7%. Unemployment is high, especially among the youth, with 52% of those among 15 and 24 years old. Female labor force participation is considered among the lowest worldwide. Important influx of refugees with high poverty rate among the refugees, and of course with the spread of the COVID-19, all the challenges had been worsened, and inequalities are expected to be even higher for the different vulnerable groups as discussed. So we start with the inequality of opportunity in education. inequality of opportunities in the region, not only in Jordan, was an important challenge. According to the ERF-UNDP report, Rethinking Inequality in the Arab States, it was found that Jordan and the whole region are doing well in income inequality and inequality in outcomes. However, inequality of opportunity is increasing in the region and is very crucial and important to achieve social and economic justice and avoid intergenerational poverty without leaving anyone behind. Though Jordan succeeds in reducing gender gap in education over the past decade, but as we expect, COVID-19 was a challenge and increases inequality of opportunity, especially with the digital access to digital services and internet. So all children living in rural areas without access to internet would have less opportunity to achieve education, higher level of education, and to follow their classes. So what was done that we analyzed the trends in inequality and opportunity in in Jordan, trying to follow what are the factors that are out of control of individuals like gender, parental education, household wealth. And this was done using the household income and expenditure survey for several years. And here I would like to thank the Department of Statistics in Jordan for providing us with the highest 2017. So following inequality of opportunity in Jordan over the years, it was found that for the gender gap, it was fairly low when it comes to the enrollment rate in primary education, as we can see from the graph. For what are the factors that affect inequality of opportunities in ever attending schools, we found that family wealth, which, as we said, is a circumstance factor outside of the control of individuals, was a dominant factor in explaining inequality of opportunity over the years, except for 2008. Mother education play an important role, as well as father's education, in decreasing inequality of opportunity. For completing secondary education, it was found that mother's education and wealth are key factors for accessing education. Parental level education combined together, father's and mother's education, are very important to achieve secondary or complete secondary education, especially from 2013 to 2017. And again, highlighting the importance role of the mother in her children's education, especially girls. Mother's education continue to be the main contributor to increase girls' opportunity to education. For income inequality, moving from inequality of opportunity to income inequality, as I said in the beginning, the story of inequality is complex, and whatever indicator we are measuring, it will be a different story. So moving from inequality of opportunity, which is one of the basic capabilities that we need to ensure that everyone have access to it without no one living behind. For income inequality, the story would change if we are talking about Gini index, which can be considered as relatively low in Jordan as well as in the whole region. While when we use other measures as pre-tax national income share, we found that there is important inequality, with the bottom 50% have around 40% of income compared to the highest 10% of the population having around 50% of the total income in 21. And this again confirms the idea that when we want to investigate inequalities, we need to have different measures, different dimensions to try to understand the complete image or story of inequalities in Jordan as well as in the whole region. As I said in the beginning, we will use expenditure as proxy for income. And again, following the Human Development Report in 2019, we wanted to move beyond average. And this is why we will use a technique allowing us to understand or tackling the factors affecting the expenditure gap between two groups along the whole distribution of income. So to compare not only the average, but also the lowest income groups and the highest income groups. And as known in the literature, the factors that can affect inequality can be individual characteristics as gender, education level, employment status, area of residence. And what we also wanted to explore with our analysis, that in addition to moving beyond average, we wanted to know if this gap or this inequality is mainly because of the difference of endowments or difference in characteristics between the different groups as endowment. For instance, education, is it mainly the difference in education between urban and rural areas, between men and women, or also returns to education. If an additional year of education would have the same impact on expenditure for men as well for women or for urban and rural areas. To be able to do this, we use the HICE for Jordan 2017, we use the unconditional quantile regression, and we focus on urban rural household and female-headed and male-headed households. We found that the expenditure per capita gap between urban and rural areas is in favor of urban areas for all the expenditure deciles, from the lowest decile to the highest one. For female-headed household, we found that they have higher expenditure per capita compared to their male counterparts. This may appear as surprising results because we know that from a wage perspective, male are gaining more than female. However, when it comes to expenditure per capita, female-headed household are doing better. And this was found for other countries in the region as Egypt and for Jordan for previous years. And this may be explained by the fact that women or female-headed households have access to other resources than wage for income, like transfers from the government, transfer from NGOs. So this may explain the difference in expenditure. We found that the 4 key drivers for this gap are education of the head, governorate or the area where they live, access to internet, and access to social protection. So the higher the level of the education of the head, the better would be the situation of the households, and this would decrease the gap between urban rural areas, male and female head household. Additionally, individuals who are living in southern governorates, the gender gap will be higher compared to those living in central governorates, and this may be because of the concentration of services. Digital divide is an important factor, and this very important result, because these results are before the spread of COVID-19 using HICE from 2017. So even before the COVID-19, access to internet was a major factor to increase income and increasing expenditure. So now with after the COVID and with accessing education and work employment from home by internet shows the importance of this digital divide and of this enhanced capabilities that became basic ones that everyone should have access to it. And of course, access to or enrollment in social security or retirement system allow to increase the gender gap as well as the geographical gap in Jordan. Moving to the situation post-COVID-19, post the outbreak of COVID-19, with a slowdown of the economic growth, though Jordan managed to reach 2.1% economic growth in the 9 months of 2021, mainly led by the recovery of service and industrial sectors. However, unemployment remained high, especially among the youth. A lot of individuals lost their income. This is why we wanted to explore who are the vulnerable groups who had been affected by this outbreak of the virus, who were more likely to suffer from decrease or declining of income. And to do this, we use the ERF COVID-19 MENA monitor data for Jordan for June 2021. And we use the large model trying to see what are the factors that increase the likelihood of experiencing decline in income. We found that individuals who are elderly, who have higher level of education, who are at the higher income group, are less likely to experience decline in income because of the COVID-19. However, vulnerable groups include female respondents living in large households, which is important characteristics of poor households, those living in urban areas, which was the epicenter areas of the spreading of the COVID, of course, self-employed and informal employees without any social protection, individuals who are employed in the hard-hit sector by the pandemic, like manufacturing, retail, transportation, food services. And of course, as a reaction from firms because of the pandemic, a lot of employees were suspended and their wage was declined, and these individuals are more likely to experience decline in their household's income. So these are the vulnerable groups that would suffer more from the spread of COVID-19 that would require better targeting for social protection programs, as we'll discuss later. Moving from income inequality before and after the spread of COVID-19 to our latest dimension, inequality in education outcomes, In fact, Jordan had already high inequality in education prior to COVID-19. And of course, COVID-19 with the school closure, there was this increased the challenges. The Ministry of Education applied several measures trying to cope with the school closures and the pandemic, like the online platform Darsak, allowing students to attend the classes virtually, providing classes on TV. However, the impact of COVID on education had what was found were mixed results. So low accessibility to online and to internet, poor internet connection, this affect negatively education. However, from the other side, a lot of students preferred online courses and face-to-face because of the COVID-19 infection. What we did in our research work is using, so here again, I will provide results from the situation before the spread of COVID-19 and after the spread of COVID-19. So prior to this, using HISE data from 2008 to 2017, focusing on sample of children living with their parents between age of 6 and 25 years old, and using sequential logic model allowing to understand the factors affecting the transition from one education level to another one. Focusing on 3 categories: no education, basic and secondary education or higher education, and focusing on characteristics as the gender of the child, educational background as wealth quantiles and area of residence. And we found again that wealth is an important factor in explaining inequality in educational outcome, especially in secondary education. Parents' education as well plays a significant role in basic education for children. So fathers with high education are more likely that, children whose fathers have higher education are more likely to complete basic education and secondary education, and this had been consistent over the years. Again, mothers' education play an important role, not only in equality of education opportunities, as we saw in the first dimension, but also in educational outcome for their children. There is no significant difference between boys and girls regarding basic education. However, for secondary education, females are more likely to finish higher education compared to their male counterparts. As we said, family wealth is an important factor in educational outcome. Children for households at the highest wealth quintile are more likely to invest in education, especially in higher level of education. However, for the areas of residence, we didn't find significant difference across the years in finishing secondary education level, except for the northern region. Moving from the situation till 2017, before the spread of COVID-19, to the situation after the outbreak of COVID-19, using the MENA household monitor data and using probit model, trying to understand what are the factors affecting 4 categories of learning tools that were available during the school closure and the precaution measures. So we have educational TV, online education, books and written materials, parental help, and in person. One limitation in our analysis is the small size of the sample, those households who have children in educational levels. We found that household income plays a significant role in online education and access to books during school closure. Syrians are more likely to use online education compared to Jordanians respondent. Also, when in the household there is a person with secondary education or higher, children are more likely to use online education. So this explains the importance of the education level of the adults to help their children to access education online. Same thing for receiving help. So respondents with higher education level would provide more help to their children. Palestinians are more likely to answer the questions that they are providing help to their children in the classwork. For educational TV, it was found that households in refugee camps are less likely to use it compared to urban areas. Same things, females and individuals who are out of labor force are less likely to provide television education for their children. And finally, regarding in-person education, Jordanians are more likely to use this type of education and compared to other nationalities. To have a bigger picture on the situation of education post the spread of COVID-19, we found that, again, wealth is an important factor. Rich families are more able to invest in their children's education. This was the situation before the pandemic, and also with the pandemic for access to internet and for television. Also, we found that, as we said, having parents with high education level or an adult with high education level in the household can provide help to their children and invest more in the education of their children. So this shows that wealth and educational background of parents are significant contributors to reduce the inequality in educational outcome, in educational opportunities, as we observed. To conclude with some policy recommendations and based on our analysis, of course, again, it's very complicated to have like a big story of the inequality image in Jordan. As we saw before the COVID-19, inequality in outcomes, inequality of income was decreasing except for equality of opportunities as the rest of the region. However, COVID-19 shows that there are more challenged and more vulnerable groups appears, like those who have no access to internet, those who lost their jobs because of their sectors who had been affected by the pandemic. So as a recommendation, we would suggest that more fiscal reforms is required to be able to target the households who are vulnerable, and to remove subsidies from the rich household who will not be affected from any economic shock like COVID-19. Also, social protection for self-employed and informal workers who had been negatively affected by the COVID-19 and are more vulnerable to any future economic shocks need to have more targeted social programs. Given also the important role of women and mothers in the education of their children, so incentivizing women to participate in the labor market, especially married women, can play an important role in investment in human development in Jordan, especially for investing in the education of the future generations and preventing intergenerational poverty and inequalities. For education, conditional cash assistance targeting less advantaged families where children are more likely to stop going to school and drop out. So such programs that condition cash transfer to sending children to school can be a relevant tool to reduce to reduce inequality in educational outcomes and in educational opportunities. Given the importance of the educational background of parents, so providing programs for illiteracy, for reducing illiteracy rate for the adults can help children in schoolwork and can decrease the inequality in educational outcome. Again, digital divide, which was considered as enhanced capability and now become a basic capability, an important capability that everyone should have to be able to find economic opportunities and to access education and e-learning. So programs reducing literacy in digital connections and having the infrastructure allowing access to internet are very important to ensure that all children from all areas, whatever their background, have access to internet and being able to access education. Finally, the limitations that we face doing such work and that can provide future research, it's mainly data limitations, as had been highlighted. For the household expenditure and income survey, we didn't have dimensions or variables for enhanced capabilities, such quality of education, for instance, or indicators or variables for health. This is why we focused mainly on education. Also, there was no variables about refugees or other nationalities than Jordanians. So this is why we couldn't do such analysis by nationality. Also, the heights didn't provide, there was no weight, so we cannot really generalize our analysis for whole Jordan, given that we don't have weight, so we are focusing on our sample. For the COVID-19 MENA monitor data, and of course, I would like to thank ERF for providing such an important data. However, so we studied the impact of the COVID-19 on declining income, but we don't have the different sources of income. So we don't know if a household respondent replies that income decline, is this because of decline in wage or decline in income transfers or decline from remittance? We don't have the different sources of income. And we believe it's an important dimension that need to be tackled to know what is the main dimension or part of income that had been affected negatively by the crisis. Also, the characteristics of the respondents we have, those they are important, but we are not sure if this respondent is the head or not. So it is a respondent on the household. Of course, it's mobile interviews, so we cannot ask a lot of questions, but this is an important dimension need to be tackled. Of course, another thing that now with the vaccination, with the different variants of COVID-19, in addition to the actual war, we believe that a lot of factors had affected inequality in income and non-income dimensions in Jordan. There is another story. So having more up-to-date and nationally representative surveys over time would allow us to continue future research, seeing what is the impact of the vaccinations, the new measures implemented by the Jordanian government, the actual war on the different dimensions of inequality in Jordan. And by this, I would like to thank you all for your attention and looking forward for all the comments and feedback from the discussant and from the floor. Thank you so much. Michaela, back to you.
Thank you, Rasha, for sharing this very rich and interesting summary of findings. And I would like to encourage everyone to also look at the 3 background papers Rasha mentioned in terms of some of the dimensions prior to COVID-19, and then also the analysis comparing pre and post COVID-19, because it provides a lot more interesting details. So I don't want to spend much time and just give the floor to the 3 lead commentators for their comments, feedback, in particularly on the findings, but we'd also like to hear from you, some of the drivers that were highlighted and the policy responses or policy implications that Rasha mentioned, and moving forward, what could be done to tailor or to, in terms of addressing some of the trends and also some of the data issues. So I'd like to introduce now the 3 commentators. Nisreen Barakat, CEO of the Jordan Strategy Forum. Ms. Barakat brings with her a wealth of impressive experience, ranging from government, international organizations, civil society, and the private sector. Her experience includes serving as Minister of Social Development and Minister of Public Sector Development, General Director of the National Aid Fund, to founding and managing a consulting company focusing on strategic planning, socioeconomic development, and M&E. Amongst many other impressive achievements, she was also named as one of the Forbes 200 most powerful Arab women in 2014. After Nisreen, we will hear from Vladimir Lasny from the UN Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia. Vladimir is an economic affairs officer and already joined us for an earlier webinar to discuss the findings of the technical background papers that fed into the policy report that we discussed. And Vladimir's research interests include labor and welfare economics, and he has published widely. And last but not least, Zina Nime, Associate Professor of Public Policy at the United Nations Merit and Maastricht University. Zina has over 2 decades of professional and academic experience in public policy, social protection policy, and financing. She's currently also serving as the coordinator of the Social Protection, Inclusive Innovation, and Development Research Team at the UNU Merit. So many thanks for joining us all today. And so over to Nisreen for her reflections on the findings, but most importantly also the policy implications and the way forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michaela. And may I first thank Dr. Ibrahim al-Badawi and Dr. Randa Al-Hussan for organizing this webinar to discuss the impact of COVID-19 on inequality in Jordan. As was mentioned by Randa, the objective of this research was to deepen our understanding on the inequality of Jordan. And it looked at determinants of inequality in income, education in terms of outcome and opportunities, but also it looked at the impact assessment of COVID-19 on income, employment, and education in Jordan. The findings of the set of research papers were summarized in a policy report titled COVID-19 Increasing Inequality in Jordan. Or is COVID-19 increasing inequality in Jordan? In my talking points, I will first outline the main content or findings of the policy report prepared by Dr. Rana Al-Hindi, Dr. Rasha Ramadan, and Dr. Riham Rizq. Following that, I will raise few comments that might be useful for the researchers before finalizing the paper. And actually, I would like to sincerely thank Dr. Rasha Ramadan on the excellent presentation she gave to us. And to reiterate that perhaps the summary paper which was sent to us to comment on did not give the full depth that the three papers, unfortunately, they were not sent to us. But I clearly could see the depth from the presentation of Rasha. So I would really urge you to look at the summary back and ensure it captured the main important messages that were highlighted as well by Rasha. To give a quick look at the policy paper, it provided a good overview of the economic situation in Jordan. It also gave some findings regarding the different dimensions of inequality. This section started by arguing that conventional measures of inequality, such as the Gini index and the share of the top 10% and bottom 50% in national income, are not sufficient to guide policy making. Therefore, the authors argued that to better understand the drivers of inequality and implement adequate policies to reduce monetary inequality, it is important to decompose the expenditure gap between two groups into endowment effect, as they call it, or as it has been used, and returns effect, clarifying that the endowment effect or the explained effect allows for understanding the differences in the characteristics of the two groups, as mentioned by Rasha, while the return effects on the unexplained or the unexplained effect, on the other hand, is the discrimination part of the inequality. Using the results of the highest 2017 and 2018, the authors estimated unconditional quantile regression, and based on their results, the following conclusion as per the summary paper were stated as follows: expenditure per capita in urban areas is higher than in rural areas for all expenditure deciles, and female-headed households have higher expenditure per capita compared to male counterparts. And I agree with the authors that this is due to the fact that female heads receive remittances and have access to social protection programs. Actually, many of these programs, they target female as they see expenditure goes to the well-being of the family in terms of education and health. Thirdly, the education level and returns to education are significant factors in explaining the expenditure gap, and being enrolled in the social security or retirement system plays a significant role in decreasing the geographical expenditure gap, especially among the poorest 6 deciles. There is a substantial inequality in attaining education. Children who belong to the richest wealth quintiles are more likely to progress in school, particularly from basic to secondary education or higher. In addition, parents' education is one significant driver of inequality of outcomes in education. This may explain why we have relatively high proportion of private sector in 2019-20, where the total number of Ministry of Education and private sector schools were 3,893 and 3,441 respectively. So when the state does not have the ability to deliver sufficient, effective, and efficient public goods and services, citizens who can afford it would seek high proportions of their needs from the private sector instead. School closures had a detrimental effect on school-aged children, and the interaction between the pandemic, school closure, and the digital divide, as explained by Rasha, contributed more to the inequality in education in Jordan, making it hard for children belonging to poor families to break the intergenerational transmission of inequality. Having said that, going to the content of the summary paper, while I tend to agree actually with the 6 main findings of the paper, which I summarized shortly, I also agree with the policy recommendations that were clearly stated by Rasha in her presentation. I also agree with the final recommendations that the national authorities should work on improving the data quality and quantity. Moreover, I would add frequency, availability, and accessibility of data to researchers. And in the public sector reform roadmap, which was launched recently, it focused actually on the Department of Statistics and the importance of evidence-based data and the need that the government and the public sector at large should enhance the quality of data to enable policymakers of taking the right decisions. Having said that, I think there are many areas of the report that could benefit actually from further analysis, and that could be again due to the reason that this paper is summarizing a more 3 in-depth paper. Going beyond just describing the data, for example, a lot can be said and analyzed about the charts presented on page 11 and 12. Also, the charts themselves need to be explained. And here I'm talking about the similarity index and the Shapley decomposition. There's also a trend seen in the charts that is not analyzed. The section on government COVID response could benefit actually from earlier reports that were produced by the UNICEF, one of them by the UNICEF and the JSF, but there are more actually that were produced also with the ERF and the UNICEF and other UN agency. This section, in my view, missed many important actions and seemed to be rushed in the summary paper, at least. For example, the work done by NAF over the past 2 years has been largely missed by the paper. Similar argument applies to the Social Security Corporation recent programs, which tackled informality and youth inclusion in Social Security. If we include the early education as a critical component of life cycle learning, we can say that the Social Security introduced a new regulation to cover the cost of nurseries. And by the way, to the contrary of the schools, nurseries were open during the period of the pandemic. And it's worth mentioning that the policymakers should consider programs, interventions that were proved to be beneficial and needed to ensure that they continue after lifting the defense law. As you know, a lot of programs were designed based on the need minimize the effect, the negative effect of the pandemic. And these programs need to be quickly assessed and ensured that they sustain since their impact was critically needed. Also in the analysis, I'm not sure how valid to compare data, to be honest, Rasha, between the various rounds of the highest as the methodology changed over time. Perhaps you should mention under the final limitation section that accurate conclusion cannot be drawn as past highest results cannot be compared to one another due to the differences in the adopted methodology. Manuel, and he's with us in this session, when we did the National Social Protection Strategy, we were very careful not to compare too much with the earlier highest rounds because of the change in the methodology. And that might explain some of the graphs they looked, and couldn't be really explained. Policy recommendations, at least in the summary paper again that was sent to us, they jumped into conclusion without sufficient discussion in the paper, like the issue of the child labor, children with special needs. It wasn't mentioned at all, but it came as part of the policy recommendation, and even early marriage, as it didn't use any data to support this conclusion. So I wonder, again, why you didn't use the DHS data, or perhaps this has been done in the separate papers, I'm not sure. And that takes me again to the final note that maybe this summary didn't capture, as I mentioned earlier, the 4 papers as it should. My final comment, Michaela, is that an interesting finding that should be really focused on and highlighted is that being enrolled in social security or retirement schemes plays a significant role in decreasing inequality. So I tend to believe that policymakers should focus on encouraging formality, as the highest risk going forward would be the expected expansion of the informal economy, which really has increased from 15.3% in 1990 to 22.4% of GDP in 2018. And I'm sure that this percentage, it's much higher now due to the pandemic. Again, I do thank you for inviting me to participate in this session, and I thank very much the researchers on this work. Thank you. Back to you, Michaela.
Thank you, Nisreen. This has been extremely useful, particularly also in terms of some of the government responses that were not adequately captured. Maybe perhaps, but Rasha can address this as well. It's also the timing of this, the second wave of the MENA or the ERF monitor, but there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of understanding proper policy responses, fiscal policy to public sector reform, and interesting also, I think the public versus private sector education is also you flagged this, could be interesting in looking in terms of how that impacts on inequality. Anyway, I want to now turn to Vladimir, and then we will, I think Rasha will respond after all the commentators have provided their comments, and I'm encouraging also any of the participants to share comments and feedback on the presentation that Rasha made or in the chat, and we will try to address some of them in the remaining time. Thank you. Vladimir?
Thank you so much, Michaela. If I may, I will share my screen. I hope this works. Please give me feedback if you don't see my PowerPoint slides now. Otherwise, I will continue. Here we go. How do I do this?
Perfect.
Yes, okay, so my voice is clear and my screen can be seen, yes?
Yes.
Great, okay. Rasha, thank you so much for really a good paper, a good presentation, comprehensive across different dimensions of inequality. For these comments, I haven't looked at recent statistics from the COVID era, so I will talk. I will show a few complementary results by ESQA from before COVID, and some of them will, I think, corroborate Rasha's findings and maybe policy recommendations. And so I hope that the presentation will be relevant and will engage us in nice discussion here. It was Khalid Abu Ismail who was supposed to be a commentator in this section, but unfortunately for family reasons he had to be away, and I'm just happy to report that everything is okay with Khalid's family, and he's just on a flight right now back to Beirut. So so it's me stuck commenting in this session. So I will just present some complementary figures on the various inequalities as according to the data we have available. These are the results that ESQA has come up with, so jointly with Khalid and colleagues Abdul Karim Jafar and Hassan Hamia. But I don't want to put, but the comments were prepared by me, so without implication. All blame goes to me, not to my colleagues. And so I will just present just a few slides on monetary inequalities over the past 10 years in Jordan, something like 5 slides, and then 5 slides going beyond monetary inequality to talk about multidimensional inequalities, but slightly different take, or maybe slightly broader than what Rasha has presented. So just quickly corroborating Rasha's findings, using evidence from consumption expenditures, and then also on wealth distribution in Jordan. Yes, we don't see much inequality. So, and here I want to maybe slightly advertise a new tool that ESQA has introduced, and currently it's in a beta version, which allows tracking inequality over time, inequality and poverty over time across countries, and even simulate evolution of inequality and poverty to future years. Moneymetrics.unesqa.org. And and I'm presenting some of the main graphs from this online tool. So we see that looking at the distribution of consumption expenditures, inequality is rather low. The Gini index is something like 0.34, as Rasha mentioned. It's been declining since 1980s and steady over the past 15 years. The same goes to the top 10% consumption share. Rasha mentioned slightly higher figure. I think she mentioned pre-tax. Here in this graph we show the and this shows final consumption expenditures, so slightly lower, topping 10% share. Looking at growth incidence over the past 20 years, we also see kind of a positive evolution where much of the growth went to the lowest income or consumption quantiles. So again, it's a positive story that in terms of income, things have been improving and steady in the past 10-15 years. In terms of looking at the poverty rates, Rasha mentioned a poverty rate of 15.7%. I think this graph here is consistent with that. So poverty according to different poverty lines. According to arbitrary poverty lines, we can say poverty rates have been declining. So if we use the current national poverty line for Jordan, it went down from something like 43% to down to something like 16% across the survey waves that we're using here. And what's the policy recommendation here? So if we worry about poverty reduction, and we think of the two main channels, how to reduce poverty, should the Jordanian government focus on reducing inequalities or increasing a level of incomes or consumption? The recommendation is that on the inequality front, things are better than on the level of incomes front. So in this graph, I am showing so-called iso-poverty plot. The shape of the graph is related to the elasticity of poverty reduction to growth of income versus reduction in inequality of income. And we see that Jordan, particularly the newest waves in Jordan, show that we're in a pretty flat region of this isoplot graph, with the implication that the government should focus more on growth rather than inequality reduction. It just reflects the basic finding that inequality is rather low, while income levels have a space to catch up. So from here, the government should focus on growth rather than reducing inequality. Okay, let me jump to a little bit of evidence on the wealth distribution. So comparing Jordan to neighboring countries, once again, we find that Jordan has a relatively low level of wealth inequality. The Gini index of wealth inequality is something like 0.67, 0.68, which is not a bad degree of inequality compared to other countries. And also in terms of the top 10% share of national wealth, Jordan fares better than its regional comparators. And so now Rasha talked about wealth being one of the important components of inequalities. And I think, so here, the comment we can make is that this graph here is about vertical inequalities, just comparing individuals, how much wealth they have, while Rasha talked about horizontal inequalities in wealth between female-headed, male-headed households or across regions. And in that sense, unfortunately, we don't have the data here to present that. We would find a greater concern. That's one comment to make here. Second comment is talking about fiscal policy. If we want to make the fiscal system more progressive and redistributional, one idea that has been discussed globally and promoted even by ESQA has been to tax wealthy individuals and so redistribute some of their funds to low income or low consumption households. So the final slide I will show for wealth is, well, we've said that there is relatively a little inequality in wealth, and the top 10% share of wealth is rather low or reasonable. Does this contradict the idea that we would impose a tax or some kind of solidarity redistribution scheme from the wealthiest individuals to lower income individuals. And this slide is supposed to show that, well, still there is a large body of wealth that is available at the top. And so we could play with the idea of either some kind of solidarity redistribution or state mandated taxing of the wealthy to reduce poverty. So we can still see that the average wealth per adult in Jordan is significantly higher than in comparator countries. Looking at kind of this, the whole body, the cumulative wealth held by the top 10% individuals is around $1 trillion in nominal terms, which is a large chunk of money. So even if we thought of introducing a relatively small wealth tax, something like 1%, it could still contribute something like $10 billion in nominal terms to the fiscal space and be able to fund poverty reduction schemes. So those are the pieces of evidence we have for monetary inequalities in Jordan. So I can summarize that the inequalities don't seem to be high, at least in vertical space, and there is still space for redistribution and using the top incomes, top wealth to help with social programs and poverty alleviation. Talking just briefly about multidimensional inequalities. Another piece of work by ESQA recently, it's ongoing work, so I will just present some preliminary results. ESQA is developing a development inequalities index, which will have something like 4 dimensions, focusing on material inequalities, inequalities in basic human development, being education, health, access to living conditions, governance inequalities, and environmental inequalities. So on this front, we can say that Russia's presentation talked mostly about material inequalities and basic human development, but I wish, or for a more complete picture, we could talk about other capabilities of Jordanian citizens and residents, to talk about access to civic liberties, political voice, and on the environmental, in the environmental dimension, also talk about the living conditions and so quality of life. In this index, we try to measure both inequalities of opportunities and inequalities of outcomes, and we try to measure both vertical and horizontal inequalities. So vertical is just a kind of a one-way snapshot between which individuals have the most outcomes or opportunities and how much exactly, versus which citizens or how much have the most disadvantaged individuals have. And horizontal inequalities, we use differences between genders. So we ask males versus females, what are the income gaps, health or educational gaps, and so on. Okay, let me jump to the results here. So this graph shows the development inequalities index for Arab countries. Jordan is on the complete right. We see that Jordan overall, again, Jordan is not doing too badly in terms of overall inequalities. And Jordan has experienced an improvement from 2010 to 2020. But the improvements have not been across the board. So in terms of material inequalities, there is no improvement. That corroborates with what I presented earlier and what Rasha said, that the inequalities of income and inequalities of wealth have been rather low, not increasing much, even going toward the COVID era. In terms of environmental inequalities, there is also no improvement in Jordan. So this is another area that where government could improve living conditions. In the environmental component of the index, we look at indoor pollution and access to water, sanitation, and hygiene. So this is another area where the authorities could work harder, according to this evidence. But we do see improvement in the basic human development inequalities, so in basic education, basic health, and we do see improvement in governance inequalities. So, but again, even if we focus on the basic human development inequalities, again, kind of to link to what Rasha has been describing, we can say that the progress has not been completely even. For example, we find that Jordan has increased its achievement, its citizens' achievements, and lowered inequalities in terms of average years of education, but Jordan has done poorly. So achievement has increased, but inequality has also increased in terms of the completion of 12 years of education. So one way to summarize this is that at the level of lower education and basic health, Jordan has increased the general access of the population to these resources, but in terms of higher education and reducing dropout at higher grade levels, perhaps Jordan has not done so well. Final slide for me will be, now if we compare Jordan to all Arab countries, here we see that if we compare income inequality to this multidimensional development inequalities index, we see slight worsening. So again, remember we started with relatively low income inequality, and now we're saying that if we introduce these additional inequalities, environment, governance, and basic human development, Jordan ranks worse than it does in income inequality alone. And I believe that concludes my thoughts. So the basic policy recommendations are Jordanian authorities should focus on non-income inequality components, and rather than focusing on income inequality, perhaps income growth would be the main channel to reduce deprivations and reduce poverty. And the good note is that there seem to be resources available. The bulk of top income and top wealth is there to introduce more progressive transfer schemes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vladimir, and thanks for also complementing that with your own data and research, which is very interesting, especially also looking at other dimensions you capture and comparing it to other countries. So maybe that's also for the next discussion on moving forward and steps ahead is how to take some of that forward to get a fuller picture of everything. But before I turn to the last commentator, Zina Nime, I would like to introduce also Reham Rizk, who has just joined us as well. Reham, Associate Professor at the Universities of Canada in Egypt. She was also a co-author of this policy paper and will be addressing some of the comments you shared. So Sina, if you want to share your comments before I give Rasha and Reham the floor to addressing all the issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for also the ERF for extending the invitation for me to comment. But before I start, I have to say that Vladimir, your presentation has been very impressive. I think I have a commentary to your presentation, which is, a side commentary to what I'm going to do. So maybe I would like to ask the ERF to perhaps arrange another debate where we would discuss some of the things that came out, because at some point I'm like, we need to talk about that point. So thank you for the presentation as well. That's just a side note. And really, it would be great if we can continue that discussion, because I think it's at the heart of also where this report tries to lead us to. So thank you, Vladimir, for that. And now going back to why we're here for the report, I also want to commend the authors and thank them for a very comprehensive report. It is great that you discuss inequality, and I appreciated addressing it from the various capability approach literature as well. At least I have not, as Dr. Nasreen mentioned, I have not read the separate papers, so my comments really pertain particularly to the report. And I think it was extremely important that you highlighted that it's not just poverty that we need to be concerned about, but rather examining inequality. Your report stresses the notion that the study of inequality has largely taken place with a single dimension, and the majority of discourse, and also we saw this in the previous presentation, has focused on economic inequality, particularly income inequality. And if we look at the literature, our knowledge of inequality has advanced considerably over the last few decades. But this has been primarily due to the fact that we have started to develop such good depositories of time series data and panel series data on various indicators, which allows us to make these different generalizations and discussions and analyses over inequality. And however, within this field, it did take time to establish a clear picture of the scale of inequality and whether inequality has increased or not. It's a very, very long-term view when we talk about inequality. And this is something that is very important to keep in mind. You do highlight this in your report, but the true study of inequality is really in need of this type of rigorous long-term type of data. Now, the report's focus on education is also greatly appreciated, and highlighting that free basic education, while an achievement, is only one step towards tackling injustice. The report rightly also pointed out to, while basic education is compulsory and free, still dropout rates are highly correlated with the wealth status of the family. And here we open, I call it a huge new box of worms, if you want to call it, because I think this is a very important topic to be debated. I do believe, depending on many different considerations, people would have different opinions on how we would proceed within that, and how wealth and wealth inequality, which is another topic altogether, would be or should be tackled. Now, so the report highly points out that while basic education is compulsory and free, dropout rates are highly correlated with health, and that gender inequality affects both genders. And I really like that you talk about gender inequality affecting both genders. And it's also worth noting, and what necessitates further policy dialogue, is that what pertains to the observation that girls have the highest share of completing secondary education or above compared to boys, and girls have lower basic completion rates. And the explanation which you put forth is the one often quoted in the literature, that boys have to work to earn income to support families, thus dropping out, and that the issue of that girls have to, due to whether it is cultural or vulnerabilities pertaining to child marriage, etc. So that is a very important point, I think, that should be even further investigated. So that was one. Additionally, I appreciated the linkages that the report made regarding interaction between the pandemic, school closures, and the digital divide, and how that created these further hurdles to children belonging to poor households. So your recommendation directed to formulating ICT literacy programs is also very well taken, but is something I will come back to later in my commentary on how to go further. There were two particular points which were also very interesting for me to read about in your report, but also left me wanting a little bit more input and analysis, which included, so you talk about that inequality is composed of two main types: inequality of opportunities, which you say arises from factors beyond the individual's control, such as parents' education, and financial resources, and the inequality of outcome, which is related to individuals, such as effort and time allocated to studying. But in your conclusion, in your policy recommendation, I still don't see what you concretely suggest in terms of tackling such a crucial problem. And I think this also goes back to a point that was mentioned by Dr. Sreen in terms of the methodology that is used in the different types of the data, because this is also another issue I will come back to quickly when I'm concluding. Another interesting point that is really worth further examining is how you say that female-headed households in Jordan have higher expenditure per capita compared to their male counterparts. And while you said that this is in line with what was found in the literature tackling Jordan and other countries in the MENA, and you offered some explanation, I believe you said that the expenditure gap is in favor of female-headed households because of the availability of different sources. And that is also something that was highlighted in the presentation. I missed how this can also fit into your overall analysis and future outlook when we talk about the gender differences and what does that mean to Jordan. That is actually a very positive point to highlight. And I'm curious if that the income sources is the only explanation. Another point which I felt was extremely important that was also highlighted already is, and I believe also from a policy perspective, it is crucial to follow up on. And actually, if we've learned anything, in my view, from the COVID-19 pandemic, it is that, and is being enrolled in social security programs does make a difference. We know this is something that we have seen in many countries, not just in the Middle East. And that is a very important thread to take on. Now, regarding the overall report, I have a few comments which I must admit could stem from the fact that we haven't seen the separate papers and they were put together. I would like to share with you and hoping you would also take them as constructive suggestions for however you want to take this report further. My first point talks about the determinants. So your report talks about the determinants of inequality, and that's what my first point is about. And you say that from the early on, inequality is multidimensional. However, it is still unclear to me how this multidimensionality is operationalized in the measurement aspects of the report. And that could also be that you have these different data waves and methodologies. Inequality is indeed complex. And the report does do a good attempt at trying to simplify an extremely complex concept. However, what I see is that what is mainly covered in the report doesn't precisely provide insight into the determinants of inequality, but rather inequality in the determinants of deprivation. And here I would like to, if you allow me to argue that they are somewhat slightly but different things. And while the decomposition that you have presented gives us an indication of inequality indeed, as well as what you did with the quintile regressions, etc., it would have been interesting if other variables were used as this independent variable to show us inequality. In some other parts of the report, which inequality is presented more in depth, it is descriptive. And while it gives us a very good picture, it is difficult to analyze patterns. And I know that this is a data issue, but then again, sometimes when you are presenting it, we are also left with more appetite. And I think that's also something good about the report. The next point perhaps pertains to the next point pertains to the decomposition of the groups. I think it is spot on that you contrasted rural and urban, and you looked at geographical locations and gender. But I totally missed where do persons with disabilities in Jordan fit into this narrative of inequality. And since we are focusing on Corona, not just persons with physical disabilities, but also with mental disabilities. Refugees is another group, and while you discussed refugees at the beginning of the report, I still feel it's missing from the overall analysis. And another point which I would really like to highlight, and I mean, I also invite all my colleagues who are working in this field, because this is something I also feel as a researcher, it's very important. And I feel it's missing in the discussion, and not just in this report, but our overall discussion about inequality and deprivation in the Middle East and in Jordan, particularly, since we're talking about it today, and that is the elderly. We know that older people have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. So in Europe, for example, according to the WHO, 95% of the deaths from COVID in the regions were among older people over 60, and the other half was among those over 80. Now, approximately half of the COVID-19 fatalities in Europe occurred in care homes for older people. And I know that's a different case, but it would have been very interesting to know what is the situation for us. And I feel a lot of times, because we are these young societies with these huge youth bulges, we forget also to talk about the elderly. And that's a very important point that I think when we discuss inequality, we should remember. Another point, which also made me think in your report, is the digital divide. And you do recommend that there should be a form of adoption of digital technology to circumvent this inequality. And here is also another point I would like to highlight. And I want to emphasize that the consequences for inequality of digital technology is to the extent that what we need to do is to ultimately facilitate collection, storage, and analysis of data to be able to further work on that divide. But for that, the main policy instrument for regulating such a divide, the digital divide, is privacy and security policy. And here, this is a very important point that we also have to be aware of, because we are recommending improved or bringing this digital divide. And I think it is paramount that we're always talking about it as well with this discussion of security and privacy. Now, I understand that is different depending on which context we're talking about. But again, this creates this pressing question pertaining to privacy and data security, which is generally not a question motivated by inequality itself, because we sort of put them apart. So kind of like when we're talking about growth, and that is my personal take, we can never talk about growth without talking about tackling inequality and social justice to go along, and these two things hand in hand. My final point, I'm almost done, is that, and I think this has been brought up, and I do think this is because of the nature that these are separate papers, but I also don't see the common narrative or the big story. But when Rasha gave the presentation, I actually really want to commend you on a very nice presentation. It actually did answer that point. So I feel like it's a little bit redundant. So my advice is that the presentation makes a very good sort of skeleton for an improved version, perhaps, of the report, because it did answer a lot of the questions that I have in terms of, what is the clear narrative? What is the story? What is the larger story? And how are you consolidating this great variance in methodologies and the ability to generalize? So with that said, I would like to thank you all again for giving me the opportunity to read the report and to comment on it, and going beyond inequality, income inequality, and looking at inequality of opportunity and the multidimensionality. I think this is really crucial to provide us with a basis for further work on advancing sustainable human development, triple underline sustainable, and to help us in formulating improved policies that would tackle social justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Zina. So I know we are running behind time, so I'll just turn over to Rasha and Reham to respond. And I think some of the issues in terms of, what you mentioned, there's a lot of appetite for more research and for looking at various data sets, etc. move forward. So maybe it can be discussed also in the next session on moving forward and steps ahead. So anyway, Rasha and Reham to reply, and thanks so much for all the great.
Thank you, Michaela. Thank you for all the commentators for all their comments and suggestions that I am sure it will help us in our future research. I will briefly reply to a couple of comments, and then I will leave the floor to my colleagues Rana and Riham to follow up. So first is a common comment that we don't have a lot of details in the policy brief, and in fact there are 5 backgrounds paper. So what we had in mind writing the policy report is to have the key messages without going into details in the technical parts. And for readers who are interested in knowing more, they will go back to the technical background papers. So this was the main idea why we didn't include a lot of details in the policy report. I would like to second Dr. Zena that we need special session on ESCWA Development Index and all the great work Vladimir, Khaled, and all the ESCWA team is doing. So I highly ask ERF to do such a session. We are all looking forward to know more about ESCWA team. Sorry, Vladimir, we are trying to get you involved in another session, but I think it's very important for the region and for all researchers interested in inequality issue. Also, I would like to answer a couple of questions regarding income inequality. So yes, Dr. Zena. So this was puzzling for us, and even I have a previous paper with Vladimir and Vito Intini decomposing inequality in the region, and it was surprising finding that female-headed households have higher expenditures than male-headed households. We don't have the different sources of income, but this was one of the explanation we found, that maybe because they are receiving more transfer. And I think this is very important from policy perspective, because I think in all our countries, we provide a lot of cash transfer and help programs to female-headed household, forgetting women who are in the male-headed household who maybe have no access to other source of income or to which. So I think this is an important point that requires more investigation. Of course, I completely agree with you that we need to have other groups like elderly, refugees, persons with disabilities, but this, because of data limitations, we couldn't do such differentiation. But I completely agree with you that these are groups that are usually forgotten when we do inequality analysis. We focus mainly in gender and on geographical locations. And my last comment, I will also do the advertising as Vladimir. So there is a joint paper with Dr. Mahmoud Muhyiddin, which is an ERF working paper available on the ERF website, where we tackle the digital divide. And I completely agree with you. We talk a lot about accessing internet and infrastructure. However, privacy and security policy is very important issue regarding digital divide, especially from gender perspective. Sometimes women have access to internet, to computers, but they are afraid to use it because of the idea of the privacy. They will be in contact with strangers. So I think this is an important dimension that requires more research and more data, of course, to investigate it. Again, thank you all for all your comments. And now I'll give the floor to my colleagues, Riham and Rana,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rosho. Thank you very much. First, I would like to thank the ERF and the UNDP for their strong support during the journey. It's a long journey, year and a half, and we have, as my colleague have just mentioned, 5 working papers, 3 before COVID and 2 after COVID. So replying to the comment of Dr. Nisreen Barakat about the COVID response and the policies that should be tackled inside the policy report, the big policy report, I'm gonna agree and confirm what my colleague have just mentioned. The pool is really very huge, and we do have like a lot of detailed information about the COVID, the response of Jordan, either in the education system or for the vulnerable. When we tackle the income inequality, we try to get, the highlights and flag the important programs from actually the literature that has been published when we are actually in the process of writing the report. So I think tackling what Dr. Nisreen have just mentioned about the COVID response, yes, we use the UNICEF report and the ERF working papers that tackle the COVID measures that has undertaken in Jordan in detail in the technical paper. So I'm so sorry that you didn't have the time to read it, but we put a lot of effort in gathering all the policies that has been undertaken by Jordan during this time. Again, for Vlad, I think I agree with him that there is a problem in the secondary and college education in Jordan. And because my part is about non-income inequality, I'm going to agree with that non-income equality is important. However, income inequality is important as well. This is what the data mentioned to us, that secondary and college education in Jordan is really very subjected to the family circumstances. It's positively correlated with the family wealth and the family educational background. So still there is high rate of inequality, non-income inequality in education outcomes when it comes to secondary and above education. Well, thank you, Dr. Zena, for reading the policy report in a detailed way, actually. So regarding the digital divide, again, I'm not going to add more. Yes, it's really very important to tackle the privacy and data security, but however, because of the COVID, which is sometimes we consider it a curse, but I consider it a blessing, that the developing countries, including Jordan and Egypt, they now invest more in the infrastructure, I mean the digital infrastructure, in case of any pop-ups that could happen in the education stop, they have to return, they have to have a platform, online platform that those children can continue educating. It was really very, it's again, they have, Jordan has here a very prominent actions. They invent Darsak, which is online platform, and they broadcast the lessons through the TV as well. But they have very good actions, I mean, very effective in order to reach to the children everywhere, including the Jordanians and the non-Jordanians. And again, adding to what you have just mentioned about the Jordanians and non-Jordanians, the data pre-COVID actually does not give us the possibility to go for the non-Jordanians. So, but actually the papers that tackles the situation pre-COVID, we have a look on the non-Jordanians. However, the limitation here is the data. It's a few actually number of observations, which does not give us like huge magnitude in order to do something, to say something generic. So, however, the papers, I mean, the papers after the COVID actually gives us, a flavor on what's going on after COVID with the Jordanians versus the non-Jordanians. Again, I really like the point that is related to dimensionality of inequality. What do we have using the data? We focus on education. Unfortunately, we don't have any other indicators that can relate the health as well. So that's why we focus on education for the non-income deprivations. And we didn't have the chance to look to the refugees due to the data. The elderly as well, it's few observations. That's why what we did is the best from what we have. I'm really very proud of the project. We get 5 technical papers out. Still, all the comments that has been mentioned about the report, I think most of it should be tackled if it's not presented in the technical paper. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for the ERF, the UNDP, for my colleagues. It was a really nice journey working with my colleagues and actually my friends. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone also for the patience running over time. And Sunday.
Sorry, Michaela.
Yes, sorry, Rasha.
Just Rana would like to answer quickly some comments.
I understand,
okay, sure.
that we're very late in terms of time, but I won't take much time. I just wanted to thank you all. Thank my Rasha and Rihem, of course. I think they covered it all, so I don't have much to add. I would like to thank also Nasreen, Dr. Nasreen, Dr. Vladimir, and Dr. Zena. All the points are extremely well taken, and I took notes of all of them. Thank you for the ideas as well for the future
research that we could do on the topic. I really like the point raised by Zaina about the elderly, and I totally agree with you on that point. I also want to thank Vladimir so much for sharing with us those preliminary evidence using this very interesting index. And I'd like to know more about how which data you use for the governance, inequality, and so on, but that's another discussion. So I'll stop there. Back to you, Michaela.
So thanks to everyone. And I'll turn over now to Randa to wrap this session up and also discuss a bit, moving forward and next steps, ideas for it. And yeah, this was extremely rich discussion. With lots of food for thought and what could be done next. So thank you, and thanks also for staying extra time. Thank you.
Thank you, Michaela. I want to thank everyone for a very, very, very stimulating discussion, and I especially want to thank Michaela for having made it possible for us to have this discussion. I am very happy to see that what's been presented and what Vladimir also brought to the table has generated yet more and more interest, question, and curiosity and analysis, potential analysis. Before I introduce Manuel, I want to just make 3 very quick points. First of all, I want to commend the report because I joined after this report was initiated. So I want to commend the report for the multidisciplinary set of recommendations that were presented, ranging from the fiscal issues to issues related to employment and labor, issues related to quality of education. For me, that's, I think, for me personally, the most important one because of the potential catalytic externalities it could have on future work related to inequality. Other policy options include awareness campaigns, of course, the cash assistance targeting, incentivizing women to be in the labor market, closing the digital gap, and last but not least, I mean, this is not all conclusive, but the data accessibility and availability issue, which remains paramount for this region if we are to do any planning, policy, or programming. The other point I wanted to raise is a reaction to what Vladimir said. Thank you, Vladimir, for injecting all of this new food for thought in what you said. And for me, it's good to know that Jordan is faring well and some areas better than its comparator. I wasn't aware how well, which makes going further or ahead more grounded and incremental. And on this, I just want to just make one little, caveat, which is the most recent, I mean, since COVID, there has been also the Ukraine war and the global climate change crisis, which has compounded the problems everywhere. And in the very latest report of UNDP, you will see that they say that some 90% of countries saw their HDI decrease in 2020 and 2021. And now the world's average human development is back to where it was in 2016. And this impacted, I mean, the COVID climate and the Ukraine war has impacted the world much more than the global financial crisis of 2009. So in terms of going further, I think it's this new index that you talk about, Vladimir, looks into some of these emerging, points, and it makes it very clear that the uncertainties, which is the topic of the Human Development Report, are rising not only in terms of economic uncertainties because of the food crisis and the looming recession, but also in terms of environmental and health threats, thus underlining the urgency for a more resilient governance structures or mechanisms. I mean, structures, I don't know, but mechanisms at least. So without further ado, I won't take too much time from Manuel. Manuel is a colleague with us here in Jordan at UNICEF. He's the Chief of Social Protection and Policy, and he's got more than 20 years of professional experience as practitioner and researcher in social protection, policy, and health in more than 13 countries in the world. He's worked with UNICEF, UNDP, World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank in the design and the implementation of social protection programs, poverty analysis, and policy-oriented research and advocacy for women and children. Manuel, over to you with a very difficult task of, bringing forward, where to go next based on this very rich set of analysis and information.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Randa, and thanks, colleagues, for the invitation. For me, it's definitely a pleasure to be part of this conversation and discussion. And for the best interest of time, I will try to summarize some recommendations on the way forward, basically in three big lines of action. The first one related to financing. The second one related to evidence and data, and the third one related to national system strengthening to make the national system more inclusive and to facilitate the access of the most disadvantaged people. So, starting from the financing part that was mentioned during the report and also during the different interventions of the colleagues, I think that the Jordan current fiscal system is modestly progressive. However, I strongly believe that more could be achieved. At the same time, but more could be achieved not just in terms of making the system more progressive, the fiscal system, also in terms of making the system more redistributional. At the same time, I think that we also acknowledge that the fiscal reforms are necessary in Jordan. We have seen during the last 2-3 years how Jordan's public GDP ratio, it's almost reaching 100%.
Oh, please. Manuel, we lost you. We'll give him a couple of minutes maybe to reconnect. I don't know, but I'm very interested to hear what he has to say. Okay, you're back, Manuel. You're back.
I think I lost connection. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Sorry, I don't know what happened. I lost the connection. No, so I was saying that we need to think about fiscal reforms that may address the issue of the fiscal gap, but at the same time may reduce poverty and inequality. For that sense, or in that sense, we need to look at the good and services taxes. We need to look at the electricity tariff, but also we need to look at the social protection reform. In fact, just as an example, there are some estimations done by the World Bank showing that just the recent expansion of the Takaful program that took place in 2020 and 2021, in which more than 85,000 new households became beneficiaries of the program, that has had an impact of 0.7 points reduction in terms of inequality, but also reducing poverty by 1.3 percentage points. And that is just that expansion of the NAF program, the Takaful program. Another aspect in terms of financing is the quality of expending. Here in Jordan, we see that on education, the government is spending around 3.6% of the GDP on education, and on health, it's around 4.1%. However, which is acceptable, let's say, for a middle-income country. However, in both cases, when we look at the breakdown of the expenditure, around 10 to 12%, it's what goes to capital investment. The rest goes to recurrent costs, including salaries. So what to do? I think that we need, and that takes us also to the evidence part. I think that we need to work together on doing different assessments like public expenditure reviews. We need to do more investment case to support the national system on which could be some feasible options to do more with the existing resources, considering the tight fiscal space, but also how to make that social spending more efficient, not just on social assistance, also on the social services such as health and education. Also, how we can support the government on doing a better redistribution of the resources that the government captures at the time of dismantling universal subsidies. Because we strongly believe that the government, yes, it's fair enough that some of those universal subsidies that are not achieving a good impact should be dismantled or targeted. However, the redistribution of those resources should go to programs such as the social assistance or the national health insurance to reach the poorest households. So the second aspect related to evidence and data. On evidence and data, I would say that in the country, we have a lot of evidence that it's produced by all the agencies and stakeholders. The key thing is how we promote the use of all that evidence for decision making and planning. Because on practice, we have seen how many of these knowledge products comes out. We have this kind of very fruitful discussions, but then at the time of taking decisions, at the time of planning, these are not used for it. So in that sense, I think it's important to bring on board national stakeholders, the government, the Department of Statistics, Ministry of Planning. I know that sometimes it's a very tough assignment, but we need to enhance those efforts to bring them on board, to encourage them on the use of this evidence, but also the availability of data and how to make national surveys more comprehensive. Comprehensive in terms that, for example, as many of you may know, right now the government is almost finishing the data collection for the household income and expenditure survey. But that household income and expenditure survey, unfortunately, won't be representative, for example, for non-Jordanians, refugees, migrant workers, etc. So in terms of having the proper information to do this analysis and to tackle the issue of inequality, it's something that we need to promote to make these national surveys more inclusive. The same thing will be happening with the DHS, the Demographic and Health Survey, that the data collection will be starting soon, hopefully in November. And there is a need to make or include some dimensions as part of the demographic and health survey that may give us this, let's say, multidimensionality of poverty. Why? Because traditionally, here in the country, the national figures are just showing monetary poverty and are putting aside this multidimensionality of poverty. So we need to promote that, and I think that would be good to create some kind of technical working group that may include not just us as external stakeholders, that we may sit in the table with the Department of Statistics, that we may sit in the table with the Ministry of Planning and line ministries to agree on these approaches. Also, in this kind of discussion, a key actor that we usually forget about is we need to bring to these discussions the Ministry of Finance. There is no way to tackle poverty and inequality without bringing into the table, without building the capacity at the Ministry of Finance. And that's something that in all, if you look all the different, let's say, working groups that we have in the social protection sector, the Ministry of Finance, it's always absent. And finally, related to the national system strengthening, on this part, I think that there are different areas that we need to and we can work with. First, related to how the importance of making further investments in the preparedness to make the national social protection system better equipped to face shocks. I think one of the key lessons learned from COVID is that the national social protection system needs to be shock responsive system. So in that sense, as UNICEF and as part of the UN efforts, we have been promoting the inclusion of a new component as part of the National Social Protection Strategy, which should be the shock responsive component of the National Social Protection Strategy. Another aspect is the importance of investing in developing flexible and scalable systems and building in the capacity of national partners to facilitate the humanitarian and development nexus. We cannot tackle inequality without facilitating that humanitarian and development nexus, considering the Jordanian context. Right now, when we look at the social assistance pillar, we have two systems that are running in parallel, the humanitarian and the national systems, without a proper coordination. And I think that this, it's not just a technical discussion because the systems and building blocks for that are in place. This is more, I would say, upstream discussion that needs to take place in terms of who will be financing this and for how long. But definitely, if we want to tackle inequality in the country, we need to consider that. Also, and it was mentioned as part of the recommendations in the report, is how to make the national safety net more not just inclusive. They mentioned the conditional cash transfer as one option. We as UNICEF, we are against the conditional cash transfers because all the evidence that we have demonstrates that there are not huge differences between conditional cash transfer and what we call cash plus approach. We are more in favor on the cash plus approach, which is mainly how we link the national safety net with services that could be health and education, with strong components of awareness, but without the conditionality. Because we, again, strongly believe that there are no, in terms of impacts, there are no difference. I fully understand that the conditional cash transfers usually are easier to sell to the taxpayers and the governments. However, in terms of impacts, there are no differences with the cash plus approach. But definitely what the evidence is showing that the cash plus approach are or have more powerful and long-lasting effects than cash transfer alone. And that's why as UNICEF, we have been promoting what we call the Takaful Plus approach, which is linking the Takaful program with the Makani program that we have. Also, we need to work on a more inclusive targeting approach with a more relaxed targeting threshold that may be beneficial for addressing economic and social vulnerabilities of children, youth, and females. Definitely, there have been a huge improvement on the targeting model of the NAF and Takaful program. That is something that needs to be acknowledged. However, we strongly believe that there are opportunities to improve the targeting formula to make it more inclusive in terms of bringing on board groups that are like elderly, people with disabilities, children, and having this multidimensional approach in the targeting formula beyond the pure monetary and poverty targeting. And finally, I strongly believe that there is no way to create durable solutions for all the three pillars of the National Social Protection Strategy without developing livelihood opportunities for youth and facilitating active participation of females in the labor market. For that, we need to tackle the root problems in terms of dealing with the traditional sociocultural norms that may facilitate the access of female to the labor market, doing technical and vocational trainings, but in line with the need of the labor market, and also how we enhance our approach in terms of employment activation projects linked to the existing cash transfer programs as an exit strategy. Sorry for extending a bit on this, but thanks again for the invitation, and any question, more than happy to answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Manuel. It's extremely interesting, and I think that we could go on and on on these issues, because we've covered so many grounds and we've put forward so many potential entry points or requirements in the medium and long term. I will just do one last round of checking if there are any questions from anyone. Okay. In that case, I want to thank Dr. Ibrahim. Please go ahead. You're muted, Dr. Ibrahim.
Thank you very much, Dr. Randa, and I would also like to extend our thanks and appreciation to the authors and the discussants, the lead discussants, and actually also for Manuel for giving us a very interesting perspective, from the UNICEF and UN perspective on cash transfers. And I just wanted to say that actually the ERF are very pleased to and grateful for the opportunity to work with UNDP, and we have been working on this, have several projects before, and would like to look forward to future. Especially from this perspective, I want also to maybe highlight a forthcoming initiative that the ERF is planning to launch a gross commission on the development path of the MENA region, where we are really focusing, the conceptual underpinnings of the report of the gross commission is basically thinking about gross social policy as an integral strategies, because as we all know, all expectations is that the social policy will be very important for sustainability. And obviously, we do have concern about environmental and climate change and how they impact the prospects for growth. But right now, the MENA region is, like many other developing and emerging market economies, is grappling with the debt crisis and and the fiscal crisis. But it's not just a question of macroeconomics, and I strongly agree with Manuel regarding the importance of Ministries of Finance, which is essentially the importance of macroeconomics for social policy and for financing social programs. So I think this is a direction that the ERF will be pursuing, and hopefully not before long, we should look at research teams that include macroeconomists working on fiscal policy and political economy, experts working on how would we actually manage the political economy considerations for transferring resources from employed workers who are equipped with the digital skills and actually quite adept to the emerging digitech economy in order to finance a pool of underpaid large segment of the population in the informal sector, as well as those who may not be able to cope with the transformation that is bound to happen in our economies. So I think the approach to the social agenda, including inequality and poverty, should actually be much broader. And we should think about, obviously, it's very important to get the micro story right and to get the data and the hard microeconomic analysis. But I think placing that into a broader perspective of macro and growth strategies and political economy would be very important for the future. So I look forward to further collaboration in order to pursue this agenda in this context. Thank you very much again.
Thank you very much. Shireen, over to you if there's any last word. I have to run to another meeting, but
just a word of gratitude. We're really
sure.
pleased to have had this partnership and looking forward to more. And please stay tuned for more events that are coming up very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.